ducks require water that is at least deep enough for them to be able to dunk their full head in. Without that, they will get, sinus infections. They're just not living a good life if they don't have at least that amount of water. If they don't swim, they won't be preening their feathers. And when they preen their feathers, they gather some oil, or technically it's a wax, from their oil gland and spread it over their feathers. And if they don't have that wax on their feathers, they're no longer waterproof. And if they aren't waterproof, they can't regulate their body temperature.
It's Duck Week here on the Beet podcast. You guys know that I'm a chicken guy, but we have Kristine, Ellis, Dunkin' Ducks on Instagram, and also the author of a book that I just got a couple days ago, Raising Ducks for Beginners and Beyond. So I'm excited to have you on, Kristine.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So I've been thinking a lot about ducks. And the reason why is because I just want more animals if I can have them. But second of all, I have a big pond. And from the little I understand about ducks, you really have to give them some sort of access to water. So why don't we kind of start with how you got into ducks, and then maybe we'll do a little duck primer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I totally understand wanting to constantly add more animals to the homestead. I got started with ducks when I was 5, actually. My dad brought home 2 little ducklings for a birthday gift for me, and I've kind of just been in love with them ever since then. And in 2017, when I had gotten my miniature duck Munchkin, my first ever miniature ducks, I created a social media account for them, and it went viral in 2021 and became, my full-time job as a duck raiser and a duck Instagram person.
I wish I had the animal experience as a kid. I collected like bugs, and I collected rocks and gems and stuff like that. And then I did remember those grow-a-frogs? Do you remember that? It was like a little kit you could get, and you could grow a frog in like a little jar.
I remember the shrimp ones, but not the frogs.
Yeah, like they were called the sea monkeys, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had those too. So I never got into ducks, but so these days, like give me a primer on how many ducks do you have? What kind of breeds? I know chickens, I don't know ducks whatsoever.
So I currently have 10 adult ducks and 3 ducklings. All of my ducks are called call ducks, except for the black one, which is an East Indie. And both of those breeds are bantam breeds, which just means miniature in duck words.
Got it. And what's the setup that you have for them right now? Like where are they living? What kind of things do you need?
So I actually just bought a house in December. So we're in the process of moving the ducks from their old setup to their new setup as we kind of put the finishing touches on the new duck house and the new duck pen. But for me personally, I keep my ducks in a Amish built shed. And then it has a pen attached to it so that they can, go out there and forage during the day and everything. But at night they go into the coop where they're safe, very similar to chickens. The one big difference is that they do need a pond. So, currently where they are, they just have like a dog pool type thing that's like above ground. And in our new one, they're going to have a really cool in-ground pond with like a waterfall and everything.
Oh, wow. So are you going to build that pond out yourself, or how are you doing that?
Yeah, so I have been slowly but surely digging this pond every day. It's a lot of work, but we're getting through it.
Okay. Yeah. I did the pond not really on my own. I had some big help from the guys over at Aquascapes. But man, it's a chore. But then once it's in, it is one of the best parts about the whole yard. And that's what kind of got me thinking about this whole duck idea. And I guess one question I have is, if I've got a chicken coop, I have a 6 by 18 foot chicken coop with a raised hen house, can you co-keep ducks and chickens together, or would that not be too wise?
So people absolutely do that, but I personally don't recommend it for a few reasons. One of the biggest reasons is because male ducks will mate with female chickens. And when they do that, their parts are not the same. So the male ducks will seriously injure the reproductive tract of the female chickens. And, mating season for ducks can last from like March to September. So that's like so much time of risking having them together. And also chickens, they have sharp, pointy beaks. Most birds love to peck at shiny things. So chickens have a tendency to like peck at the duck's eyes, and they can't defend themselves because they don't have a sharp beak. Another thing is that they also have like different diets, although they're very similar. Ground fowl and waterfowl are just, they come from different places in the world and they need different things. So it would be hard to keep them together and feed them two separate foods. But when
Yeah,
people free range them, they typically don't have problems with them being together. It's more of a like, you don't want to confine them into the same coop at night kind of thing.
that makes sense. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I didn't think about the beak pointiness having an impact on like whether they can or can't defend themselves. Would you say let's imagine my situation. You know, I got a decent sized pond. What would be the smallest amount of ducks I could keep? What would be a breed that's like your beginner breed, get into ducks? Like in the world of chickens, maybe an Orpington, right? Just like very simple hen. And then what would be like the smallest sort of DIY duck coop, I guess, setup that I could have?
So I would recommend getting a minimum of three ducks. Technically, you could get two. I always just say three because just like chickens, they're flock animals. So you never want them to be alone. So I say get three. That way, if something happens to one, the two still have a friend. But they do very well in large flocks. They do very well in small flocks. It doesn't totally matter so much how many exactly you have as long as they have a buddy. So when it comes to duck breeds, there's there's two main categories of domestic ducks. There's everything that is derived from a mallard duck, which is literally every breed, except for Muscovy ducks. Muscovy ducks are their whole own thing. And a lot of the information you'll read and learn online about pet ducks does not apply to Muscovy ducks because they're a separate species, whereas all of the other breeds are all derived from mallards, so they're all the same species. So, really, when it comes to selecting a breed, I say they're all very good. You just don't want anything that's bred too extreme. So, you don't want to go for like the jumbo Pekin ducks because they're going to have health issues because they grow way too big and get arthritis and leg problems. Now, on the other hand, there's smaller ducks. If they're bred to be too small, they'll have trouble laying eggs and they have their nose holes might be too small, so they have trouble breathing, that kind of thing. All of my ducks are miniature ducks. They're my favorite. I absolutely recommend them, but they are a little bit more tricky because they can fly, unlike most breeds of domestic ducks. So for a beginner, I would definitely recommend something like a khaki Campbell. Um, they lay a lot of eggs. They're a small breed and, very basic duck care, nothing really specific to them that you need to know.
They're a very cute looking duck, I have to say. Khaki
Yeah.
Campbell. It seems like it's sort of similar to maybe dog breeds or any sort of specific like human led breeding programs where the more extreme you stretch the feature, whether it's size or like, snout size, whatever, the more issues you tend to have. I remember I was down in Baja, Mexico with some friends and family, and you see all the Mexican street dogs down there, and they just seem like a very balanced classic dog, right? Because
Yeah.
they're just mutts, and
Yep.
they seem to not really have a lot of problems. They seem to be pretty even temperament. It's like, okay, well, it makes sense because that's sort of what they are supposed to be without human intervention. Muscovy ducks, like what's the primary difference there? I'm kind of curious about that.
So Muscovy ducks is it's like they're really just their own thing. Those are the ducks that a lot of people call them ugly because they have those caruncles that grow on their face, which is like it looks like a red blotchy, I don't know, kind of like acne on their face.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of
Um,
like a turkey-esque face, I guess you could say.
yeah.
It's a little
So a lot of
turkey-like.
people really don't like that. They're also an invasive species, so a lot of people really hate them. But you can keep them as pets because there are domestic Muscovies, and they're a lot more similar to like dogs. Like they tend to be very friendly and they wag their tails when you come up to them, but they're massive. They're like the size of a goose.
Wow.
Um, so they're gonna, need a lot more space and a lot more food. Their claws are ridiculously sharp. They are very good at, perching. Regular ducks don't like perch, regular domestic ducks don't like perch in trees at all. They barely even fly because most of them can't. Whereas Muscovies will fly around, they will perch in trees at night. Um, and they're also a bit more difficult to take care of in the winter if you live in a northern state because they're much more prone to frostbite, both on their faces and their feet. So they're just a little bit more complex simply because they're different, and all of the information you read about ducks is going to be geared towards breeds derived from mallards.
Yeah.
Nothing really goes into detail about Muscovies.
And do you have any? Have you ever kept any Muscovies?
I actually was sold two Pekin ducks at one point, and they turned out to be Muscovies, so I had to rehome them because they weren't going to fit through the door of my duck coop because
Oh
they're
wow.
so big.
Wow, I had no clue that was the way that worked. Ducks versus chickens. I'm kind of curious. Like, first of all, Christine, have you kept both? And then I'm just looking to understand like the basic differences between these two birds.
Yes, so I have kept both. I'm just a duck girly right now, but I'll definitely be adding ducks in the future. I'll definitely be adding chickens in the future again because now I have my own property, so I can do that. But I definitely prefer ducks, of course. And one of the main reasons I prefer ducks is because they have amazing immune systems and chickens just do not. Like, when I had chickens, I felt like they were always just like, I don't want to say randomly dying, but they get sick a lot more often,
Yeah.
whereas ducks are immune to most bird and poultry illnesses. Like bird flu,
Wow.
for example, everybody's talking about bird flu right now. Yes, ducks can get bird flu, but most of the time they just spread it and live with it. Whereas if a chicken gets bird flu, it's probably going to die pretty quickly.
That's honestly a little rude of ducks to get it, not have any issues from it, and then just spread it around to other people. That's a bit rude, I have to say.
Yeah. That's why a lot of people are like really concerned about the wild ducks when they migrate because like they could just be spreading bird flu across entire flyways.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chickens don't do that. So that is a plus one for the chickens, I guess.
I will say that my hens they just seem to be a bit more fragile as birds. I totally agree with you. I lost one hen, unfortunately. I think she was egg bound. It's hard to exactly say. I didn't do like a full autopsy or anything. I have a hen right now, Rufio, who's a cream leg bar, which is kind of a specific like English breed, I think. And she's just a very fragile, sensitive hen. Like she'll get tired easily, and I'll have to feed her like extra electrolytes, or she'll like recently she's been kind of like working on a back leg sprain, and I'm just like taking her out every day, making sure I give her the right food and babying her a little bit. And so ducks just, I guess they're just a lot more hardy then, huh?
Yeah, they definitely are. And they're more cold hardy too. When it comes to heat, chickens and ducks take it about the same. But when it comes to colder temperatures, ducks are definitely more better suited.
Yeah, yeah. What about like their sort of life cycle or their pattern over the course of a year? Like for hens, you get sometimes molting in the winter. You get a little bit slower egg production. Do ducks follow a similar pattern?
Yeah, so typically duck molting is a very interesting topic because they don't just molt all at once, kind of like chickens. Like chickens do, I think, what's called a sequential molt, where they like molt their head feathers and then their back feathers and then their tail feathers. So it's kind of like, but it happens all at once, like throughout a couple of weeks. Whereas ducks molt specific feathers at specific times. So like my ducks molt their wing feathers around early August, but in the spring they molt some of their smaller feathers. It's different, but it's the same. The ducks will never look naked like a chicken does while it molts.
Oh my God. Yeah. I have to say, like, my girlfriend and I both, we love caring for the hens, and we'll come out, and when it gets to be wintertime and one or two of them are molting, I notice that my attitude to them slightly changes. I go, you just look ragged right now. They just look
Yeah,
a little ragged, a little haggard. Of course, I still love them the same, but like sometimes they look pretty rough. Just like scary
definitely.
little weird creatures. Duck care versus chicken care. You've kept both. Would you say one's easier than another, or is it just different?
So for most people, chickens are going to be much easier simply because they don't make incredibly messy mud pits with their pond. You take the pond out of the equation and things are just going to be cleaner and you're not going to have to clean as much. So
Got it.
chickens work out better for a lot of people if you don't want to be cleaning all the time.
Could we maybe talk about that then? The need to have a pond or water source of some kind. Why is that required for ducks?
Yeah, so ducks require absolutely necessity for life. They require water that is at least deep enough for them to be able to dunk their full head in because they use the water to clean out their eyes and their nose. Without that, they will get, sinus infections and they're just not living a good life if they don't have at least that amount of water. But it's also very important for them to have access to, a pond to swim in, because if they don't swim, they won't be preening their feathers. And when they preen their feathers, they gather some oil, or technically it's a wax, from their oil gland and spread it over their feathers. And if they don't have that wax on their feathers, they're no longer waterproof. And if they aren't waterproof, they can't regulate their body temperature.
Wow. Yeah, that's a long chain of events that can go wrong if
Yeah.
you don't give them some water. So is the basic thing to do in a duck coop or duck pen, you could even just give them like a little kiddie pool full of water and change it out frequently, or what's like the standard thing people do?
Yeah. So the probably the cheapest solution is just to buy like a regular old kiddie pool from Dollar General. A lot of people nowadays are getting dog pools from Amazon because they actually have a drain on them, so it makes it a lot easier to clean them out. And then, of course, the cool, fancy ducks get their own ponds that are in ground and don't have to be cleaned out as often, which makes it a lot easier to care for them.
What benefits does a duck have to, let's say, a gardener, right? A lot of us listening are gardeners. We love chickens, of course, for their eggs, but we also love them for their ability to forage pests from the garden. And we love the ability to use their droppings and compost those down and then reapply those to the garden. First of all, I don't even know. Are you a big gardener? I have no idea. And are there benefits that ducks have that maybe chickens don't for gardening?
So, since we just bought our property in December, I'm actually starting my first ever garden this year. I
Hey,
would say
nice.
I definitely didn't have a green thumb before, but I noticed the area outside of the duck pen, the grass grows back ridiculously fast. The grass is always greener outside of the duck pen. And last year, actually for my book, we were doing the book photos and I wanted to put marigold flowers around the pen so it looked nice in the pictures. And I literally bought the flowers the day before the book photo shoot because I was like, I can't take care of these flowers. They're going to die. I need to just get them from the flower store and it'll be fine. Well, they didn't die until winter because I never watered them. The ducks just splashed their duck fertilized pool water onto the marigolds and they grew beautifully. And that's
Right.
because duck manure is excellent fertilizer and it's better than chickens because you don't have to compost it and wait for everything to break down for it to be safe to garden with. It's as soon as they, pop it out, you can use it in the garden.
That's interesting because we hear all the time, of course, with chickens, it's more of a hot fert, as they say, like high nitrogen, readily available, can sometimes burn plants, and usually better to compost through a system. I guess ducks then sort of reminds me of like a rabbit fertilizer, which you could apply, droppings you just apply directly to the garden. That's pretty
Yeah.
interesting. That's pretty interesting. That's a point in the ducks camp for me. Okay, so we've got a bit of a primer. Anything that we have not mentioned about chickens versus ducks that you just want to put out there?
When it comes to gardening or just having ducks in your yard to, fertilize and everything, whereas chickens will scratch the grass and dig it up from the root and, make big holes and patches in your grass, especially if they're kept in a small area. Ducks dig with their bill and they just make little tiny, quarter-sized holes in the grass. So they're not destroying the garden from the root. They're just
Mm,
foraging for bugs. And it's less likely to destroy things in the garden.
that's interesting. I also saw a documentary a while ago, Little Big Farm, I think it was called, where they ran ducks through their orchard and the ducks were eating snails, I think, off of the
Yes.
trees, which I thought was kind of an interesting approach. I think it's more of an ancient technique than that farm really led us to believe, but I didn't think about it that way. I don't think chickens tend to hit up snails that aggressively.
Yeah. So I'm going to make an assumption that in that documentary, they were probably using runner ducks, which are the ducks that stand up tall like penguins.
Yeah.
Those ducks are absolutely the best foragers, hand down. They love snails and slugs. And because they stand upright, they have the ability to pluck them off of taller tree, well, not tall trees, but off of, the bottoms of trees and your tomato plants. And they can actually, reach those things, whereas most ducks can't. So they are excellent ducks to have in the garden.
I have, of course, my setup for feeding my hens. I am relatively ignorant to how to properly feed and care for ducks. And so, do you mind just giving us a bit of a primer on the routine, the setup?
Yeah, so the simplest thing you can do for your ducks is just go to the feed store, buy duck feed, and be like, Woohoo, I did it. You don't have to think about it because the feed companies have already done all the hard work for you. But if you want to know a little bit more about what goes into making duck feed, I go very in depth about all things duck feed in my book. And, you know, especially the differences between duck food and chicken food, because they are similar animals, but they're not the same. One of them is a ground fowl that forages food in the grass and initially from the jungle from their descendants, whereas ducks mostly forage their food from ponds. So a duck feed typically contains fish meal for the protein, whereas a lot of chicken feed is either like cornmeal or soy something or other. So it's just different, at a base level of what goes into the feed. For ducks specifically, they need a lot of niacin in their diet, whereas chickens do not. It's extremely important, especially while they're growing as young ducklings for their leg development. And yes, they do get niacin when they forage for like worms and snails and bugs and fish and everything else they forage for, but it's something that you really need to make sure is in their diet. But if you buy a commercial brand of duck feed, it's going to be in there. I personally use the Merrick's Vet Manual to decide what brand I should feed my ducks. I pretty much look at every nutrient they have listed on there, such as protein, phosphorus, calcium, and I'm like, okay, this is how much my ducks should be getting. What brand is closest to that? And so I feed my ducks Missouri Waterfowl Maintenance Feed. I personally love it. My ducks love it. And they designed the formula so that it can float on water, which is perfect because naturally ducks forage for their food in water.
Yeah. Yeah. You're mapping to the closest you can get to their sort of native environment, which makes a lot of sense. That's the thing I learned, when I first started keeping chickens, because I raised them from day old chicks. So I didn't incubate eggs. I haven't gone to that level of the journey yet. I actually would like to someday. But what I learned from the woman who gave me my initial my chicks, is she was like, yeah, don't like try to craft your own recipe here. It's been well studied, especially chicken feed for like 100+ years. Just get something basic. And it sounds like it's pretty much the same with ducks, which I think is pretty comforting because you don't have to do a lot of that thinking. Although, of course, at your level, you're getting really in depth with it, which I think is also really interesting.
Yeah, I found that a lot of people that try to make their own diets at home, they often fail on the smaller things. Like they'll get the protein percentage correct and they'll use like sunflower seeds to do that. But sunflower seeds are ridiculously high in fat, and then they don't calculate the percentage of fat. And it's like, don't bother doing it yourself because getting the little amount of calcium and selenium and niacin and phosphorus and making sure that those things are in balance with one another, that's really hard to do with just whole grains. But, feed manufacturers, I know a lot of people don't like them, but they have done a lot of research on making things the right way so that these ducks can live a happy and healthy life.
Yeah, I think to me, I feel like it's always a balance. There's definitely this desire, I think, for a lot of gardeners, a lot of animal keepers to like do something a little more, quote, naturally and DIY a lot of different things, which of course I would understand that. At the same time, there's also this whole idea of like, well, we have studied, companies and scientists, et cetera, have studied what these animals need and have crafted things. So maybe you graduate into making your own formulations when you're maybe more at your level versus the very first time you raise little ducklings. So when we talk, Kristine, about feeding the ducks, like I have a Coop Works feeder. It kind of looks like an alien UFO thing with these little holes at the bottom, and hens can kind of come in and peck. Is there a way that you feed your ducks, like a system that you use or a methodology?
So because I feed my ducks food that floats on water, I can't leave it out for more than 12 hours because, it being out in water and in the hot sun, it would mold probably pretty quickly. So I just give my ducks, approximately the amount of food that they'll eat in one day in the morning in just a regular old bowl from the kitchen, and then they get another bowl at night.
And you just chuck that on the water surface.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So they can, of course, not eat on the water because if they were foraging in the garden, they would be picking up random things. But that's just how you're preferring to give it to them in the more sort of natural way they would eat.
Yeah, ducks also, they don't produce saliva and they don't, peck one thing of food at a time either. They kind of scoop with their bill. So, and especially because they don't produce saliva, they are at a high risk of choking. And so you definitely want to make sure, even if your food isn't put in the water, it's next to water because otherwise they will choke on their food, which is obviously not good.
sometimes I really wonder of the intelligence of the birds. Like we had the founders of Grubblies on, who is who we love for chicken feed. And they mentioned like chickens are highly visual eaters and, they tend to not eat things that they know won't be good for them. And then you sometimes go like, you hear all this stuff on the internet. Oh, you can't feed chickens this, you can't feed chickens this. And I'm like, well, my hens seem to like that just fine. And they also seem to hate some of the things that everyone else says that they love. And I'm like, shouldn't I just sort of trust that the animal knows what it is supposed to eat to some
Yeah, I
degree?
mean,
To some
chickens
degree.
will eat styrofoam, so
Yeah.
they'll really eat anything. I found that ducks are a bit more picky, especially my own personal ducks, because pretty much anything that is new to a duck is just absolutely terrifying to them. So
Mm,
I have to give them something repeatedly before they'll even really be willing to try it. And a lot of things like I would never give my ducks tomatoes or spinach because just like citrus fruits, they can block calcium absorption. And
and
a duck that can't absorb calcium might have trouble laying eggs. But so many people feed their ducks tomatoes and spinach, and their ducks love them. And seemingly they have no effect. So it's kind of like everything in moderation kind of thing. I mean, I wouldn't risk it, but a lot of people do.
yeah. Yeah. And I think it's just, I guess at some point it does come down to personal preference of how you want to care for your animal, despite perhaps best practices. The question I have now, though, is, one of the things I love, especially as spring becomes summer, as summer becomes fall, as fall becomes winter, is I tend to let my chickens out and true free range the backyard for a couple weeks. Because that's a great time for them to kind of come clean up scraps and eat little bugs and pests and balance their diet out a little bit. So with ducks, as a gardener, are there plants that I could grow in, say, just the average backyard, whether it's a raised bed or a container in ground, like a little duck garden? Like what would be the top picks?
Yeah, so the one thing with ducks is, unlike chickens, they can't pull things and to break off pieces. They can really only scoop with their bill. So for most things, you are going to have to like cut it up for them if you wanted to feed it to them. They're not just going to straight up eat it out of the garden. But a few things that ducks absolutely love are peas, especially cucumbers, marigolds. I'm sure you know that marigolds can give them a nice, deep, rich yolk color.
Oh yeah.
Um, Oregano is very good for their immune system. There's a lot of things that you can grow for ducks in your garden.
And would you? That's kind of interesting. Now I'm going. I can barely ever eat all the peas I grow. It's especially if you plant, a nice row of them. Like it's very hard to eat them all. And so I go, maybe I just like grow some and then throw it in the duck pen and then just have them munch away. Or I could even
Yeah,
shell them and have them eat the shelled peas.
yeah, and peas are they're a good source of niacin because they have more niacin than most other things. And as I said, niacin is very important for ducks. Not enough for them to just eat peas and not eat any more in their regular diet, but it is very good for them.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Any like little treats that you give them? Like, for example, with my hens, I give them these black soldier fly larvae that have been dried up. And I kid you not, we have one hen Wednesday. She's a black Australorp. So she's like an all black hen with just a red comb and that's it. She will try to force her little body through this outdoor like run grate that we have, which maybe is like a 4x4 opening just to get them. She's that manic about them, which is wild. She's the only one who does it to that degree, but they all really love them. Are there duck treats that you give every so often?
So duck treats like that are very similar to chicken treats. I give mine mealworms, black soldier fly larvae, but the one thing that ducks just absolutely go nuts for is anything that is live and moving. So I try to like you can get from bait stores usually like live minnows or live mealworms or even earthworms. And if it's moving or wiggling around, they just go crazy for it. And of course, fish is a natural part of their diet, so it's both good for them and it's enrichment for them and it's a good snack.
Yeah. Yeah, I have these in the pond actually. I have these mosquito fish. I forgot the species name, but I put in maybe like 15 or 20 and it took a year, but now they're breeding like crazy. Like there's got to be like 120 in there and they're tiny. It's a big pond. So like it can actually support them. But I was like, I wonder if I've now grown food in a future world where maybe I do have ducks. If I could just toss one of my ducks in the pond, I'm sure they'd be able to get some of those fish, right?
Yeah. So, like, if you think about it, ducks are It's definitely a learning curve because like in the wild they almost have to learn how to like catch fish and everything, whereas in captivity some of my ducks are not so smart, not so good at catching them, so they have to be fed in a bowl. But there are a few ducks I have that I could probably put them on a huge pond and they would chase the fish right down and catch them.
When it comes to a duck coop, is there like an off the rack thing you'd recommend for someone to start with, or is it more of a you kind of have to DIY it?
So really, I think the easiest thing is to just buy a shed. But with
And
ducks in particular, that you might not have to deal with chickens is that they splash water everywhere. So you just buy a wooden shed, the floor is going to rot
eh,
because it's going to be wet 24/7. So if you go that route, you definitely want to put some kind of like even cheap vinyl flooring or like rollout flooring so that the wood itself doesn't rot. But you can also get like PVC sheds. They just get, hot. So you have to make sure you have lots of ventilation and cut extra windows in those. Um, but usually I just recommend just buying a shed. You could get a chicken coop, like those prefab ones, but usually they're like break pretty easily.
yeah,
And they also usually have a big ramp, and ducks tend to not like going up ramps to get into bed. You can do it, but they oftentimes just won't use them.
that was going to be my question because chickens are effectively like tree birds in the wild. Like they'll roost up in the canopy, not in the canopy, but like above ground, and that's why you have like an elevated hen house. You have some roosting bars. But ducks, it seems like you could just put them in a shed. We'll talk about a pool in a second or some sort of water source, but they don't sleep above the surface of the ground, do they?
No, they just sleep on the ground. If I put hay bales in there, some of them will sleep on top of the hay bales. But that's also brings me to another really interesting point about the differences between chickens and ducks is that chickens go into a deep sleep at night. So they don't technically need food at night because they're sleeping.
Mm.
Ducks, on the other hand, they do not go into a deep sleep. They consistently wake up every few hours, get up, walk around, eat, and drink. So you should give them access to food and water at night.
Do they also like nap in the daytime then?
Yes. It's pretty much
Okay.
just a constant cycle of I'm awake for a few hours, I'm asleep for a few hours, 24/7.
Interesting. So they're just sort of like living a different type of life compared to chickens or even
Yeah,
humans. They're not on that day cycle.
they're definitely party animals. Like if I left them out at night, they would just party on the pond all night and quack all night long. Like they don't care. They just want
That's
to have fun.
that's so funny. Okay, so imagine we have a shed or a duck coop. You like you said before, you have to give them some source of water, and you recommended just a kiddie pool as far as basics go. Is that really the best thing, or if let's say you want to get a little more deluxe, like what would you do?
Yeah, so if you want to make life easier for yourself, I would get a dog pool from Amazon because a lot of them have drains. And if you just have a kiddie pool, it's going to get dirty very quickly. You're going to have to change out the water, and you can't just like lift up a kiddie pool to dump it. Like you're going to need, to bucket it out or get some kind of drain thing to do that for you. But if you get a dog pool, you just pull the plug. Simple as that. Now, if you really want to get deluxe, your ducks will love you if you give them a fancy in-ground pool.
Yeah, which just sounds like what you're working on. Do you know how big your in ground is going to be in the new place?
I think it's about 10 by 6.
That's pretty big. It's pretty
Yeah.
big. How deep? How deep are you going?
Only about 2 feet because they don't like I just need enough space for them to be able to dive and splash and have fun, but they don't really, they're not going to dive 6 feet down and eat dirt. They're just not going to do that.
Yeah. I think mine is it's probably like 2.5 feet deep at the deepest. And it brings me to the question. So if you're going in ground on your pond, you can't put a pond in a shed. So sounds like you've decided that you're going to at least somewhat free range your hens in the back or your ducklings in the backyard, right?
So I actually have a pen that we're building to attach to the shed because the predators here are just crazy. I have free range ducks in the past and I can't do it anymore because we have every wildlife that just wants to eat them and is usually successful at eating them if given the opportunity. However, I do let them free range at least twice a day, every morning and every night. But I stand out there with them and watch them so that they're safe.
They're safe. And so let's talk predators, because the one experience I've had, true sort of scary experience, was there was a Cooper's hawk here in San Diego that dive bombed lavender, which is one of my lavender Orpingtons, and the hawk actually got a little chunk of her feathers. No skin, no breakage of the skin, thankfully, but freaked her out for a while. And she had this weird like gap in the back of her little booty, and there's just nothing there. I felt bad, and that was a pretty rare occurrence. But it made me think like, okay, maybe this outdoor run, I need to do a little bit of extra protection here. And I don't let them free range truly in the backyard all that often. Like I mentioned, like only at the season breaks. But all the other predators, like the mammals that might have come, I've put like a predator apron on the coop so they can't even dig under, which is what they try to do. And so I guess my question would be, are the predators for ducks similar to the predators for chickens? And then what have you done to help prevent their access?
Yeah, so I would say the predators for chickens and ducks are absolutely all the same. There's nothing really that could hurt one and not the other. What I personally do is I also have like an apron skirted out around my pen with 1/4 inch hardware cloth. It is worth mentioning though that a lot of hardware cloth is made with zinc, and ducks can get zinc poisoning if it, eventually it'll start to corrode and leak into the soil, and then the ducks eat the soil, and then they could get zinc poisoning. So you can get PVC coated hardware cloth, and then you don't have to worry about that. But I wrap my whole pen from top to bottom, all the sides, everything in that 1/4 inch hardware cloth, because I mean, even the smallest little predators like rats and weasels and fisher cats can get in very small holes. So chicken wire, chicken fencing is just to keep chickens in. It's not to keep predators out.
And will a rat actually go for a duck?
So unfortunately, I have experienced a rat problem before. I lost 2 ducklings to the rats,
Oh,
and the rat also bit a hole in my duck Sugar's neck. But she lived.
what? Just bit a
Yeah,
hole in the neck?
just the straight rat tooth hole.
Why would Why? That's great. Like while
So
alive.
the rats wanted to eat the duck food, right?
Uh
And
huh.
then they would eat all of it and run out and be like, well, I guess I have to eat the ducklings now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's so
that
weird that a
was,
rat would try to eat a living large creature. You know?
yeah. I don't know if maybe, because I wouldn't be surprised if the ducks tried to attack the rat either.
Uh.
So they could have like gotten into a scuffle. I don't really know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
thankfully, it wasn't that bad. Obviously, a hole in your neck is not good, but it could have been a lot worse if it was some like bigger mammal kind of predator.
Yeah. Man, no kidding. I had a rat problem. Unfortunately, it was like in my house because I live in a 100-year-old home that's actually not that big, and there was all these little holes. It was a remodeled home, but they didn't plug up a lot of different things, and it is crazy what a rat can fit through. I'm talking like
Yeah.
I believe it's a dime or a nickel size,
Yep.
something like that. And I'm talking like a big ass rat, not a tiny little
Yeah.
guy. And I'm like, how is that possible? So I haven't had rats in the coop yet. I think mostly because they can't reach the food. The CoopWorks feeder has like these metal legs that are cylindrical that they just can't get up.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm lucky there, but yeah, it's really wild all the different types of predators. It feels like, especially for chickens, which are definitely the most prey bird I've kept. Almost anything can get them, uh,
Yeah.
and so I've seen we have a lot of crows in our backyard, and now I have one raven, which is a lot bigger. And the crows actually don't like the raven, but the raven seems to like the backyard. Just, I think there's a lot of activity, a lot of biology in the backyard now. And one of my hens, Chetty, who is a Wyandotte, she'll jump out of the outdoor run every day. So in the morning, she's always free ranging, and I'm just like, whatever, you do you. Like, you're gonna have to accept the consequences of your actions, Chetty. And the raven now and her have developed a love-hate relationship where the raven flew down right next to Chetty in the middle of the garden, and they squared off for like 20 seconds, beak to beak. And the raven like wings up, Chetty fluffed up, and they kind of just kept doing that. And I was like, what am I watching right now? Like I tried to pull my phone out and record it. I couldn't get it in time. And Chetty won. Like she scared the raven away. The raven like went back up on the thing and like kind of cowered. So I don't know. It's very
So
interesting
interesting.
dynamics. Like I would have
Yeah.
never thought, because the raven for sure could have destroyed Chetty if she wanted to, but I don't think a raven's trying to eat like a live bird most of the time anyway. So
Yeah.
I
I
think she's
think
just
that
more
ravens
curious
definitely
than anything.
like their eggs though.
Yeah, probably. Yeah,
They
which
will steal those.
they would absolutely steal the eggs, and fortunately the eggs are locked down. Like there's no way a raven can get to the eggs. But anyways, cool. If you've been convinced by Kristine, Dunkin' Ducks, and the author of Raising Ducks for Beginners and Beyond to raise ducks, like I pretty much have, then this is going to be a great episode. We're talking about ducklings, so incubating duck eggs, and even how to rear them from ducklings. And I think that's what I would do if I was going to do this. With chickens, Kristine, I raised from day old chicks instead of like going the pullet route with like a 4 or 6 week old hen. And so to me, it was really rewarding. Obviously, like somewhat time consuming, but also really rewarding. And is that how you typically do it? Do you go from duck eggs or do you go from ducklings?
It really depends. I'm about a 50-50 split on whether I hatch my own eggs or I bring in new stock, which I'll usually start with ducklings because I always want more colors.
When you do that, where are you sourcing from most of the time? Someone local?
So I have pretty much always gotten my ducks somewhere different, which is partially because I want, different genetics within my flock because I do every once in a while hatch my own eggs and I don't want to. I know technically it's line breeding with ducks and it's not as bad as true inbreeding, but I want a wide genetic pool.
Yeah.
So I most recently I got some call ducklings from Metzer Farms. I've gotten a lot of ducklings from just individual breeders, local breeders, faraway breeders, all kinds of things. The one thing I don't really buy them from farm stores though, because then they won't be sexed. And you definitely do not want too many male ducks because they will not treat your female ducks too kindly.
We hear the stories. We probably can't even mention the exact mechanisms here, but it's pretty brutal in duck reproduction world, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I say you should get at least a minimum of 3 females for every 1 male, but some males will require a lot more females.
The alpha ducks.
Yeah.
Yeah, crazy. Is it easy to sex ducklings? Because sometimes it depends on the breed for hens. Like some of them you really can't for a while, and some of them you can pretty quickly.
So there's, I think, only like maybe 1 or 2 sex links duck breeds. So for the most part, the only way that you could sex them as ducklings is either through vent sexing, which you have to be very highly trained to do that. So in most cases, you would be ordering from a hatchery in order to get sex ducklings, or you could DNA test them. I use IQ bird testing to test mine. You can do a eggshell sample, a blood sample, or a feather sample. Mail it off to them. I think it's like $15, and then they tell you if it's a male or a female, which is, not cost effective for most people.
No, but it's an option if you're really, really stressed about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's imagine, I think probably the most common thing here would be rearing from ducklings, I would say. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. Because duck eggs are a little bit more tricky to hatch than chicken eggs because of their humidity requirements.
Got it. Okay. So maybe we'll talk about that in a second, but I'm curious. Let's imagine either way, you're at the duckling stage. What sort of brooding setup do they need?
So it's definitely very similar to brooding for chicks. Ducks are, of course, going to be a lot more messy because they love to splash water everywhere. I use a heat plate for my ducks and a expandable pen. So it starts as like a little square with the heat plate. And that way, when they're, less than a week old, they stay close to the heat. And then once they get older, I can expand it and make it bigger and bigger and bigger until they get their, adult feathers. But the one thing that I absolutely recommend for when you have baby ducklings is because they love to splash their water everywhere and make a huge mess. And you don't want them to be wet all the time, of course. And if your bedding is all gross and wet all the time, it's going to smell and it's not going to be fun. So I put their water bowl on top of a paint tray with a grid. So they're not getting the bedding wet, they're getting the paint tray wet. And then you just dump the paint tray once a day and rinse it, put it back in. And you don't have to worry about cleaning dirty bedding every single day. Like I know most people that have ducklings have to clean their brooder probably 2 or 3 times a day because they just make it so gross. I only clean mine every couple of days because I manage the water very well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think something that I did with my hens both times I've raised from chicks was I elevated the food and the water at beak level on like this little concrete block. And so I had those like circular feeders just because I noticed that they weren't at the level of development where they were like, I think I'll be nice and tidy, you know?
Yeah.
And they just kept stepping or pooping in their own food and water. And I was like, okay, well, if I raise it off, it went from literally having to clean it multiple times a day to maybe once every 3-4 days, which is just like really nice. Um,
Yeah.
for ducklings in the brooder, you have to give them water, like you mentioned, obviously for drinking, but also for the purposes that they need water for, just generally, right? And so,
Yeah.
what kind of like bowl setup would you give them?
So a lot of people will even just use like a milk jug container because you can cut a hole out of it, and that way they have to stick their head in, but they can't physically get in and splash all of the water out. You could use like a takeout container, anything, with a lid that you can cut holes in so that the ducks can't actually get in the bowl and splash it all out. You don't want them, I mean, it's not like well, I guess they could drown in a bowl, but most of the time they're not going to drown in a bowl. But it is important to know that you can't just like put your baby ducklings that were hatched in an incubator in the bathtub and leave them there unsupervised because they will drown.
Interesting.
Yes,
Okay.
they can swim, but only for short periods of time when they first hatch. And they also don't have their oils yet, which keeps them waterproof. So you don't want them to get waterlogged and, run out of energy and drown. So you don't want them to be able to swim in the brooder.
Definitely not. Interesting. Wouldn't have thought of that. How would that in the wild? I guess they just alternate between being in a body of water and then like waddling around on land, right?
Yeah, so in the wild, the oils from the mom duck transfer to the baby ducks. So
Uh,
that is one benefit, but also in the wild, they're in a pond where there is access to walk out of the pond.
yeah.
There's always a way for them to get out. There's always, the shoreline where they can just have their feet in and they're not totally in. They also tend to hop on their mother's back. In a bathtub, you put them in, they can't get out.
Right. Right.
So,
That makes sense.
I mean, even with your duck pond, no matter what you have, there should always be some way that makes it easy for even adult ducks to be able to get out easily. Like I have concrete blocks just stacked on mine so that they can use them as little stairs and walk right out.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so I'm everything I'm asking, I'm trying to map to like my experience just with chickens, but as they grow up in the brooder, do they get to a point where, much like chickens, you get to kind of that pullet stage and you can introduce them to the larger coop where they're eventually going to live their life? Does that map similarly, like 4 to maybe like 6 to 8 weeks from hatching, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's very similar to raising chickens. Once they have all of their adult feathers grown in, then they can regulate their body temperature and then they can go outside. Of course, they can go outside for short periods, before that. But the only thing is, like with integrating them, you can just, once they're 8 weeks old, put them in with your adult birds. But keep in mind that they are not fully developed in their reproductive organs for a few more months. So if your male ducks try to mate with your female ducks during this time, that could end very poorly. So you might consider keeping them separated a bit longer.
Got it. Well, I did not think about that. Yeah, it's interesting because with hens, almost all the time, especially even on a regulations basis, you just can't have roosters in like a
Yeah.
suburban environment. Often, there's one, or there used to be one down the street. And I knew because obviously it was crowing all the time, and so you just never run into this problem of the male female dynamic with hens. It's just a
Yeah.
bunch of girls running around. So I keep having to like reset my mind on that. Because would you ever just recommend not even having male ducks at all?
Oh, you definitely don't have to. Unless you
Okay.
want fertilized duck eggs because you're trying to hatch ducklings, you
Yeah.
don't need a male. I mean, they do, protect their women and keep an eye out for predators, but if they're in a predator-proof coop, it doesn't really matter. You could
Mm,
also keep a flock of just male ducks because male ducks tend to be rehomed a lot more often and like they kind of have to go somewhere.
yeah.
But then you might still run into issues where they fight a lot during mating season.
Yeah. And you're not getting eggs in that case, right?
Right.
Right. Which I assume, I mean, is that part of why you're raising ducks, is to enjoy the duck eggs, or?
I don't really like eggs in general, which is so weird because like I have probably 200 eggs on my counter right now,
That's
just
so funny.
waiting to be eaten. And maybe one day I'll make something and like an angel food cake or something and use a bunch of them. But they do work really well in baked goods compared to chicken eggs.
Mm.
Like they make everything fluffier and more rich. And
Is it
duck
the fat
eggs,
content or?
um, I don't particularly remember what specifically about them makes them make things fluffier.
Yeah,
But they do have a different egg yolk to egg white ratio.
I see. I see. Yeah, I was going to ask if I've had duck eggs, I'm sure. But I haven't had them like back to back with a chicken egg. So I was going to ask what the taste difference was. Sounds like they're a bit more rich.
Yeah, so they're definitely a bit more rich. And so my problem with my personal duck eggs is that I feed my ducks a diet that is mostly made of fish meal, and I don't like fish. So the eggs, they're a little fishy. Now, if you were feeding your ducks a diet that was, cornmeal based, they're not going to be fishy, but my own eggs are a little too fishy for my taste.
That's so funny. Any tips and advice on if someone does want to hatch, what would they need? What would they need, and how would they do it?
I would always recommend getting an automatic egg turner in your incubator. Just makes life a lot easier. You don't want your ducklings to get stuck to one side of the shell because they haven't been rotated enough. And then I just personally definitely recommend using an incubator that has a humidity reader because that is a lot more important for ducks than it is for chickens. A lot of people with chickens, you can do a dry hatch. You could try it with ducks, but it's a lot less likely to actually work. With my own eggs, I usually keep the humidity around like 50 or 60% for the first period of their egg life, and then when
Yeah.
they get to the last 3 days before hatch, I raise it up, usually to like 70 or 80% for them. Most duck eggs take 28 days to hatch. That's why I didn't use a specific number of days. But the ones I raise only take 26 days.
Would you say that it's recommended, or is that like kind of like, hey, if you really want to get into this, try it from eggs, but otherwise, I'd recommend just doing ducklings?
I mean, I feel like incubating can lead to a lot of issues if you don't like if you don't do it right, you might be producing ducklings that have issues. Like if there's too many fluctuations in things and you don't get it perfectly right, you're gonna hatch ducklings with problems, which isn't great, of course. So it's oftentimes a lot easier for people to just start with ducklings that are healthy and strong and came from people who really know what they're doing. But if you're into hatching, if you have experience with hatching chicken eggs, or even if you just do a lot of research beforehand, you can definitely make it happen.
Yeah. Okay. I'll have to think about this because I'm excited about the idea of ducks. I don't know if I'll get them on this property or not, but I even with chickens, I have never hatched, and so that part of the journey seems a bit fun to explore. So thanks for sharing, Kristine. And I know you've got the book; it's out. I'd love to hear a little bit more about it and where people can connect with you in general.
Yeah, so you can find me on all social medias. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, Threads. I am posting duck content pretty much everywhere. It's a fun mix of fun little duck videos and educational videos. And my book can be bought anywhere you buy books online. So Amazon, Barnes and Noble. If you're in Canada, you can buy it on Indigo. And my book is just a beginner's guide to all things duck. And I called it for beginners and beyond because even if you already have ducks, I can almost guarantee you're going to learn something new from this book because I have pretty much spent my whole life loving ducks and learning about ducks. And I continue to learn more about ducks as often as I can because I just love them so much. And I just want to make the world a better place for ducks.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I appreciate you coming on, and you've definitely converted me to probably getting ducks at some point. Like I said, I don't know if it's gonna be at this house, so don't hold me to it. But either way, I'll be following along. And thanks for coming on, Kristine.
Thank you.